Ooh. Hello, YouTubers! My name's Willie. Welcome to my channel. What I have for you today is Reaction Request 135, The Legion of the Damned. Now, this is the 6th out of 6 video from the Cursed Founding, Arch Warhammer's creation, and this was requested by CJ Falcon. So let's watch this. 3, 2, 1, play. Dun 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 dun. Greetings.
Salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore, where we are today going to look at the Legion of the Damned. Spooky wookie. Something along those general lines, anyways. So, Legion of the Damned, burning magical space marines. And I mean magical in the most literal sense of the word. They, amongst other things, are on fire. And they don't seem to mind. That is a talent that most humans do not possess. Secondly, their bolt guns never run out of ammunition. I don't mean they never run out of spare magazines, I mean they never actually reload their weapons.
Really?
Ever. Which suggests to me that the Warp actually has pretty good television coverage, because clearly this is a trick that they picked up from 80s action heroes. And speaking of the Warp, yes, we're actually going to have to get into the question of what exactly the Legion of the Damned is, but before we do that, let's talk about something less interesting, because that way I can make sure you watch more of the video. No, wait. For reasons of pacing, yes, that sounds way better. So, Legion of the Damned appears whenever the Imperium has done a stupid thing and is about to get their asses kicked. And generally speaking, these are events where they have absolutely no chance whatsoever. We're not talking about a large war like Armageddon, for example, or any kind of scenario in which the Imperium might actually be able to do something. We are talking the classical kind of the cavalry rides in at the last second kind of situations, where the poor beleaguered Imperial Guardsmen, or indeed Space Marines, or Sisters of Battles, or any other Imperial organization, are very, very much so
So they're the trump card, huh?
The Fat Lady has not just sung, but performed an encore, walked backstage, changed clothes, flagged down the taxi, and travelled halfway back to her hotel at this point.
Huh.
And then at the very last possible second, because they are unmitigated drama whores, the Legion of the Damned will appear in a boof of sulphurous smoke and start viciously murdering anything within, well, considerable range, in fact. Because it turns out that the sulphurous burning ghosts are really, really, really good at stopping other things from breathing. In fact, they are so talented at the art of liquidation that the previous masters of said job, the Adeptus Astartes, look upon the fiery apparitions of the Legions of the Damned with undisguised green-eyed envy. Now, of course, part of the reason why they are so incredibly good at mass liquidations is due to the fact that they cheat like filthy little bastards and don't have to reload their weapons.
Yeah.
They are also pretty much all psychics to one degree or another. They have been proven to at the very least have telekinetic talents, which means that they can turn a greenskin's bones to mushy mush just by glaring at him, which is a very useful talent when you're trying to make them stop moving.
Usually.
And there's, of course, also that whole covered in flames things. As I mentioned in the Flame Falcons video, fighting an opponent in melee combat that is literally on fire, yet provides him with absolutely no disadvantages, is uncomfortable. Not simply because the dude is literally on fire, and fire has a nasty habit of warming up the nearby area and spreading to other things filled with fat and burnable materials, like, for example, enemies.
Yeah.
But it is also considered to be slightly unnerving by most sentient creatures to fight what appears to be a demonic being covered in hell flames, bearing down at you with a massive two-handed sword, also covered in hell flames. Not to mention the fact that they fight in eerie silence, never uttering so much as a grunt, a war cry, or any sound of pain whatsoever. There is also the whole thing about their armor being pitched black. Not as in their armor is painted black, as in their armor seems to literally absorb light. Indeed, the only reason they aren't simply a poorly defined black outline bearing down on you with murderous rage is the fact that their iconography glows with the same corpse light that they are surrounded with. Indeed, they are the spookiest of spooky skeletons, but that is not the only reason they are so effective. Not only do they cheat and have infinite ammunition and are spooky as all hell, they are also really, really good at what they do. You mustn't misunderstand or think that they are just cheaty little bastards. They do actually display a ridiculous level of skill. They are compared to swords masters of the finest quality amongst the Adeptus Astartes, as if every single one amongst them is a veteran of 100 battles. Now, this is a little bit interesting, because of course this suggests that they've been alive for a very, very, very long time indeed. And yet, if we're going to go by certain theories, that wouldn't really be the case at all. Oh, and of course, it also does help that whenever they cut somebody with their magical knives, whoever they cut instantly burst into flames, and unsurprisingly, their flames are not of as a benign a nature as the ones surrounding the Legion of the Damned. But let us now get into the real meat of it. What exactly is the Legion of the Damned?
Yeah, what is it?
Now, there are many, many, many theories indeed. Some suggest that they are a lost chapter of Adeptus Astartes that have somehow merged with the warp. For example, they might have entered the warp, their Gelothiels have been overwhelmed, the warp flooded into the ship, and instead of flooding it with good old-fashioned toothy demons, somehow it merged with the ship, causing the ship itself, and indeed its inhabitants, to become parts of the warp.
Interesting.
Now, this sounds like a little bit of a far-fetched theory, because we don't really have any other examples of this happening. A ship essentially becoming part of the warp because it was stranded in the warp. It also sounds like it would be, well, rather impossible, basically, because the warp is the exact opposite of the material universe. It is matter and antimatter. They are so radically opposed to one another that it seems extremely unlikely that they could ever occupy the exact same space in such a harmonious relationship. Now, of course, it is the warp, which means more or less anything could happen, but that seems far-fetched. A better explanation is that they are an existing chapter of Adeptus Astartes that have either gotten lost in the warp or touched something they really, really shouldn't have touched, and were instead corrupted by the warp. However, they managed to retain their loyalty and their sanity, remaining corpus mente, despite the fact that they were now crawling through a ship that would occasionally grow eyes, specifically for the purpose of winking at them, or little orifices that would randomly appear on walls and poop all over the floor for no apparent reason, or tentacles growing in the bathroom, you know, the usual shit that happens when the warp has properly taken hold of something. Now, this is more believable because the warp is a very, very unstable entity. It basically has a absolutely ginormous strike range. It either turns everything into slavering monstrosities, or does virtually nothing. You could be exposed to pretty much the blunt force of the warp, and get turned into a gibbering maniac pile of flesh, or it could change the color of your eyes. There really is no way of telling.
Nice!
So it is entirely possible, and has in fact happened on occasion, that Astartes will be corrupted by the warp, and yet retain their sanity. They might, for example, get a mutation, but try to justify it to themselves as a blessing of the Emperor, or perhaps a punishment that they simply have to live with, and they can only prove that they are not corrupted by allowing it to stay on their body, and then perform the Emperor's work despite it. And
there you go.
As a reverse example of this, we can look at the Iron Warriors, the Chaos Space Marines. They are most definitively Chaos corrupted. However, they view Chaos corruption as a sign of weakness. They will happily, treat with the various entities in the warp, make pacts with demons. They will happily utilize the various powers of warp creatures through nefarious rituals. They'll happily sacrifice people, etc. But they view any form of physical mutation as a sign of weakness, a sign of shame and failure to the person in question,
Interesting.
and they will lop it off immediately. In fact, it's almost become a bit of a ritual. First, they will remove the offending limb, themselves, of course, and without anesthesia. Then they will burn the offending limb, and only after they've done that, making damn sure that nothing remains, then they will go find medical aid. So again,
nice.
physical mutation does not necessarily mean mental mutation, because, chopping off one of your limbs, then burning it on the floor, and then finding medical aid is a sign of a healthy mind. Okay,
Clearly.
Well, they are the Iron Warriors. They are a little bit batshit, but the point still stands. This does, of course, not really narrow down the possible candidates much. A common theory is that they are the Firehawks, who disappeared in the warp after being dispatched to deal with a Dark Eldar incursion never to be seen from again. Now, this is of course possible, but there's also no real guarantee. In fact, I personally think that they are not Legion of the Damned, but that they have somehow been affected by the warp. I think that they are an organization of corrupted Space Marines that are still loyal to the Imperium, and realizing that they can't serve the Imperium openly, instead decides to serve it covertly. Again, we have multiple examples of chapters doing this. And the reason why I think this is because they appear to be far more blatant. For example, there is a story of them saving a Mechanicus outpost and leaving behind a banner, which was quite clearly of Firehawk origins. Now, of course, it is entirely possible that this was simply one of the first times the Legions of the Damned did anything, and so they decided to leave behind a trinket. Possible, but yeah. Their later history does not suggest that that is a thing they actually do. In fact, it sounds a hell of a lot more like something the Firehawks would do. Because the Firehawks were a very, very proud chapter. They would want somebody to know that they had done this.
And that they were still around.
The Legion of the Damned does not display any clear insignia beyond, skulls and glowy things, which is again something that would go against the Firehawks. Now, of course, they might have determined that they were cursed, and therefore they would want to purge their heraldry to keep it pure, but again, that doesn't seem like something they would do. A chapter like the Firehawks, so utterly convinced of their own righteousness, so zealous, I have a hard time imagining that the first explanation they would happen upon was that they were cursed. If anything, they would either come to the conclusion that they had been affected by some dark gods, in which case they would fight against that with every ounce of strength remaining, retaining their pride and heraldry, or they would slowly but surely become spurned believers. They would think that the Emperor had abandoned them. Despite everything they had done, they had never betrayed them. They had remained his most zealous of servants, and yet he had cast his eye away from them. Considering their prideful nature, I have a hard time believing that they wouldn't simply just go rogue at that point. There's also a host of other details that seems to suggest that the Legion of the Damned are something quite separate from a corporeal entity. For example, the fact that they seem to be linked so closely to the warp, and their ability to move, quite literally, across the galaxy in mere moments. They do not seem to obey the laws of reality, or indeed the warp, half of the time. Now again, I do believe that the Firehawks have probably been turned into something, and that they are still loyal, but I do not think they are the Legion of the Damned. For example, we know that the Firehawks still utilize ships, as one of them have been registered after their supposed disappearance, and the Legion of the Damned doesn't seem to at all.
Really?
Additionally, the one Firehawk ship that was spotted dropped off a couple of containers, which contained dead Astartes, presumably some form of burial ritual. And considering that the Legion of the Damned has been widely reported to simply just buff away in a pillar of fire instead of, leaving a corpse, that also seems to suggest that they are not the same entity. There is another theory that suggests that they are, quite literally, the Legion of the Damned, that they are ghosts. dead Space Marines return to life for one last chance at glory, to do one last good deed for the Imperium before slipping away into the Immaterium. This would not be an entirely unheard of event.
Especially
ghosts are real in 40k. They do exist,
or the dark elves.
Not in the way we would
Space
refer
elves,
to
sorry
ghosts.
about that.
They are more along the lines of
coming back
echoes
through the warp.
Of particularly horrifying events, for example, might leave a literal echo, as in a replaying of the event in the area where it happened. So, if your granddaddy died in a particularly vicious and horrifying way, you could potentially talk to him. Or hear him screaming a lot, basically. It's not exactly something that would normally be considered to be utilized in this fashion, shall we say. The dead usually don't come back to life to protect the living in 40k, but Space Marines being Space Marines, perhaps their will is simply stronger or sufficiently different for them to impose themselves upon reality, even in a dead state, in a more direct fashion. Not impossible, although I can't come up with any examples off the top of my head that I would consider to be able to back up this particular idea. The best comparison I think I could come up with is something that is similar and yet not really similar. It's from a Gaunt's Ghost book, or indeed a short story, I believe, where a sniper is in a temple. The temple gets hit by some such nonsense, and the sniper takes a pretty severe blow to the head. After this, he starts seeing an angel, a literal angel, a woman with wings and everything, that tells him that he needs to fight on. He tries to explain to the angel that his head is hurting a lot, and that he's really not in any shape to do anything at the moment, at which point the angel puts on a commissar cap and pulls out a pistol from God knows where, and tells him of the consequences to not fighting on. At which point the sniper, realizing what's best for him, picks up his weapon, and as if by some miracle, through the lens of his sniper scope, he immediately spots the enemy's leader. A rogue preacher leading a massive horde of chaos-worshipping zealots. If he dies, the horde almost certainly is going to disperse. And, while feeling, quite literally, the barrel of the bolts gun pushing against the back of his head, as if he is experiencing some incredibly heavy headache, he takes aim, fires, and plants a supercharged lasbolt right through the rogue preacher's skull. And as predicted, the entire enemy horde looks at their hero, their icon, their literal link to God falling, with a gargantuan hole blasted in his head. They waver, and they flee, saving the Imperial Guard regiment in the process. As the sniper turns around, there is no angel there, except a statue of a saint, a winged woman. Coincidence? Perhaps.
Interesting.
Maybe he really did hit his head and, well, imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was all just one big coincidence. It's entirely possible, but this is also 40k.
Yeah.
Again, not precisely an example of a ghost, quote unquote, but it is at least something similar. I think this theory might have part of the truth, but not the full truth. I suspect they are not some corrupted Space Marine chapter. Indeed, I do not believe them to be corporeal at all. I think they are simply demons. So let me expand upon this a bit, shall I? So, we know how chaos functions. They gain power through belief and certain actions. For example, an act of rage empowers Khorne. Drastic and or radical change empowers Tzeentch. Corruption and rot inspires Nurgle, and giant throbbing semi-electrical dragon dildos inspire Slaanesh. But those are, of course, not all the feelings in the universe. In fact, there's quite a few others. And we also know that just general belief can have an effect on the warp, and in turn, an effect on the material universe. For example, when you have millions upon millions of orcs together, their technological capabilities increase drastically, despite the fact that they don't appear to actually regain any real technological skills. They can create spaceships, although the spaceships would not be considered to be void-capable by the Imperial Navy, and yet they are. Another, perhaps even better example is their aircraft. By any normal understanding of the laws of gravity and physics, an orc fighter bomber should simply not be able to get off the goddamn ground. Its half-assed construction, its material composition, and the virtually non-existent maintenance should guarantee that the aircraft should shake itself into tiny little pieces on takeoff. And yet, not only does it get off the ground, it is, in performance, comparable to Imperial Navy Thunderbolts. Not to mention, of course, the tiny little detail that flying a hyper-advanced fighter aircraft like a Thunderbolt requires a ton of electronics. A lot of the more mundane tasks of flying an advanced aircraft like that is handled by the machine spirit. Computers, basically. Things the orcs considered to be pantsy and virtually useless.
It's basically
an orc
lost.
Aircraft is considered to be top of the line if it contains a fuel gauge and maybe something to indicate roughly how much ammunition is left in the guns.
Looking like pure
and
evil
yet
creatures.
Again, their flight characteristics are comparable to that of Imperial Navy aircraft. It simply shouldn't happen. And yet, if enough orcs think it's going to happen, it will.
Cool
it's the same idea with the red ones go faster. The orcs firmly believe that if they paint their vehicles red, they will go faster. And, voila, they go faster. Now, it is, however, important to point something out. We are not talking about just faith or belief here. We are talking about an absolute certainty, an absolute conviction. Because this is the question that gets brought up quite often. What if you convinced an entire planet of people to believe that gravity didn't exist? Would they just fly off the planet? No, because they know gravity exists.
Yeah.
At the back of their minds, they understand that gravity is a concept. If you could convince 1,000 generations on that planet that gravity does not exist, then maybe. You essentially have to have them believe so utterly and completely in this thing that there is absolutely no room for doubt whatsoever. Absolutely nothing. And that is simply not in the human condition. That is why the Chaos Gods that are the most powerful feed off emotions that are not based on subjective belief. Anger is not rational. Lust is not rational. Rot is entirely natural and inescapable, as is change. These things are part of the human condition. We can get rid of them no more than we can get rid of our need to breathe. And indeed, I would go one step further. I would say that it is not only key to the human condition, I think it is a universal factor within 40k. Even the Elder, as much as they loathe to admit it, fall prey to these exact emotions. In fact, the pretentious little cocksuckers are the primary reason why we even have the 4 Chaos Gods in the first place.
Yeah.
And as we all know, the 4 Chaos Gods have their own little servants. In fact, they've created their own little pantheons, consisting, of course, of demons, most of which are essentially mindless beings. They are simply parts of a greater whole. You could say that a bloodletter, for example, is merely a sliver of corn rather than an individual being. In fact, they are warp predators. They are, technically speaking, individual entities, but they have no mind of their own, so to say. They're not capable of complex thinking. They are beings of emotion and instinct at best. And then you have stuff like the greater demons, which are capable of, well, at least to a certain degree, individual thinking, planning, etc., although they are still mostly driven by instinct. It's just that they can plan out things far more effectively. So if their primary instinct is, for example, to murder a buttload of people, it will be able to plan out, set up, and execute a scenario in which it murders a buttload of people. As for the complexity of said plans, well, they depend at least in part upon the deity in question. Khorne, for example, is rarely going to be beating all that much around the bush, while on the other hand, Tzeentch, well, he enjoys a good old-fashioned conspiracy theory, and will weave webs of intrigue so deep and confusing, even the guy who started it barely knows what's going on. And then, of course, there's their favoured servants, the demon princes. Now, again, these are probably the most independent of all of these gods' servants. They still remain corpus mentis, although they have been heavily influenced by their chosen deity.
Yeah.
Which means that, again, their goal is probably going to align with said deity, but the means they utilize to get to said goal might vary quite considerably. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that a worshipper of Khorne might suddenly put into Plan Tzeentchian-level schemes or anything, but they will almost certainly be capable of a bit more subtlety than a greater demon. And I bring this up because now, let's have a look at the Legion of the Damned. With all of that in mind, is it not possible that the belief in the God Emperor as a, well, god, might have created an entity in the warp that is the God Emperor? Now, it does not necessarily have to be the Emperor at all. In fact, it could be an entity entirely separate from the actual Emperor. However, considering what we know about the warp, it certainly wouldn't be a stretch to suggest that such an entity exists. Though it also has to be mentioned that this is a somewhat unique circumstance. Technically speaking, the Emperor isn't dead, but he also isn't far from it, and at this point, he mostly exists as a psychic being operating the Astronomicon. And hell, we're not even entirely sure if he is aware of what he is actually doing. We don't know if anybody's had any successful contact with him. The latest point of contact we know of, for the relative certain, would be during the Beast Arises, where the Eldar tried to talk to him by charging his goddamn throne room and killing his Praetorians. Eldar fucking diplomacy.
Yeah.
Ugh. Anyways, they could not establish any kind of psychic connection to him, or indeed get anything out of him, despite being very, very close to his throne room. They could also not speak to him psychically from a distance, although they were, at the point, relatively speaking, quite close. And we're talking relatively in terms of psychic powers here, which means within the same goddamn solar system. We have, of course, also the ginormous cocktease that was Guilliman, wandering into the throne room and then coming out a few hours later telling nobody what happened. My personal theory is that Guilliman wandered in there, saw his father, and just broke down. That is my take on it. I don't think the Emperor spoke to him at all. I think he knew that his father was basically dead at this point, but he couldn't actually kill him either. He couldn't put him out of his suffering because he was necessary. Which is why Guilliman has been reintroducing the idea of science and progress into the Imperium. I might do an entire video on this at some point, but I don't think they communicated at all. At least, that is my theory. Now, with that in mind, could a being like the Emperor, which at this point exists more like a psychic being than as a corporeal creature, possibly be connected to the warp entity known as the Emperor? Or hell, could he actually have been absorbing this belief and becoming the God Emperor? Considering how much the Emperor knows about the warp, I would say that is far from unlikely, although again, absolutely no precedents exist of that. And hell, I don't even think you could necessarily make a logical argument based off how the warp works, but again, tis the warp. It does whatever the warp does. But to return to the point, I still do believe that the idea of the Emperor being a god, although not necessarily the Emperor, confusing, I know, but the warp entity called the God Emperor would almost certainly have access to a fair bit of godly powers. Now, he's not going to be anywhere near as powerful as Khorne, Nurgle, Tzeentch, or Slaanesh, because these beings have existed for far longer. And the basis for their power is also far more primal, far more common. Because even if worship of the God Emperor naturally, considering it is a state-enforced religion, is rather common within the Imperium, it is not as common as getting really, really angry or getting a boner. But he is still actively worshipped by billions upon billions upon billions upon billions upon billions upon fucking billions. So he is definitely going to have some powers. Now let's return to the idea of motivation for the Chaos Gods, because you can discuss a lot whether or not the Chaos Gods are actually sentient beings, and to be honest, they're almost certainly not in our understanding of the word. Khorne is as far removed from our sensibilities and our understanding of sentience as we are to ants. But what we do know is that these entities are at the very least interested in increasing their own powers. Now, whether or not they do this because they know it's going to increase their power, or because it is an instinct, or hell, even just an aspect of their very being, we don't know. But Khorne, feeding off violence and anger, etc., wishes to spread violence and anger. Slaanesh feeds off debauchery and therefore wishes to produce larger quantities of dragon dildos. Nurgle would like more people to get the flu, and Tzeentch wishes to spread communism. Therefore, it would be natural to assume that the being we refer to as the God Emperor would also wish to spread his own influence and power. So first we have to identify what actually spreads/increases his power. Well, being the God Emperor, obviously spreading the worship and maintaining the worship of the God Emperor is going to spread it. Secondly, the God Emperor could perhaps be referred to as a being of order. Now, way back in the day, there was actually a Chaos God of Order. Not the God Emperor, but an actual Chaos God of Order. He was essentially the Chaos God of fascism. Everything was to be ordered and proper, and anything and everything that would go against the order of things would therefore have to be stamped out in the most ruthless manner possible. Not the nicest of things, and honestly, I do believe that the Emperor himself would probably deviate from that description, due to the simple fact that, once we read about the God Emperor, it seems like he was genuinely interested in maintaining the human race. That seems to be his core goal and ideology. Therefore, I would probably say that you can't really classify him as a god of order, since that would be naturally very oppressive, and the Emperor never really had a big track record of doing that during the Great Crusade, or, well, you know. He did have to do it occasionally, because occupied planets and all, but most of the time, people enjoyed a far greater level of freedom during the Great Crusade than they do in modern 40k, for example. And of course, it is entirely possible that the God Emperor, or the being we know as the God Emperor, is so different from the actual Emperor that he has turned into this deity, but I would consider that to be a little bit of a stretch. And I think the only real thing we know is that he wishes to maintain the Imperium, because obviously that's where all of the worship is coming from. So he wishes to keep that alive, and he wishes to increase said worship. So how do we go about spreading the idea of the God Emperor as an actual deity? Well, miracles sounds like a pretty good start, like, for example, certain angelic apparitions. That might be something. Or perhaps an army of vengeful spirits. Demons, you might even say, intervening in moments where everything seems lost. You know, where it's going to have by far the biggest level of psychological impact. And additionally, here's an interesting little thing. We of course know what demons are, and most people within the Imperium has at least a basic understanding, in that they don't know how the warp works, but they know the warp is bad, and chaos is bad. Therefore, demons must be bad. And here's why that's relevant. When the Legion of the Damned appears and saves somebody's butts, within days, the people who have been saved remember almost nothing about the incident. Now, I would posit that that is because if you look upon this critically and non-religiously, which, there is a danger that they might do, this starts looking an awful lot like a demonic incursion, doesn't it? A bunch of dudes covered in literal hellfire pop out of the ether in bursts of sulfur and start murdering everything within reach while disobeying pretty much every single law of the physical universe, and then, when all of the bad people are gone, they simply just poof, disappear in another burst of sulfur. Just a tad bit suspicious. And, of course, since the God Emperor doesn't have demons, wink wink, it's best if his loyal subjects don't remember too much about his demons. Which of course means that the Legion of the Damned are those very same demons. They appear as Adeptus Astartes because they are the Emperor's avenging angels. Everyone knows
when they
about
see
the
the
Adeptus Astartes. They are a common figure in Imperial mythos, in their
Members
history.
of the Imperium are
Very few have
going
ever
to go,
seen them, but everyone has heard the
help!
stories.
Yay!
They appear in the Imperium's darkest hours. They cannot be killed. They slay without pause. They are superhuman saviors. But at the same time, they are also figures of dread. If you don't behave, the Emperor's angels will come for you.
There you go.
And now, when you come to think about it, that sounds exactly like the Legion of the Damned, doesn't it? They slay without pause, they're certainly scary to look upon, and they always arrive in the nick of time. Almost as if they are bound by certain rules. Or instincts, you might say. But Arch, if this is the case, why aren't the Legion of the Damned popping up all over the place, you might ask? Because if them saving the Imperium is what's going to grow their power, obviously they would do it wherever and whenever they can. Well, it's the exact same reason why demons aren't popping up all over the place. There has to be the correct series of circumstances available for them to manifest themselves, even in the relatively brief period that the Legion of the Damned operates. The veil between the worlds has to be relatively thin. Not to the point for a full-on chaos incursion, because again, here's the thing, when demons of chaos pop into the world, their primary goal is to spread chaos, because it's a hell of a lot easier for them to achieve their goals if they do so. And they don't have to worry about the PR of being demons. Their supporters are well aware of the fact that they are demons. So they wish to stay for the long term, establishing portals and even pulling entire planets into the warp to add to their god's domain. The Legion of the Damned, however, really only wants to hang around for just long enough to wipe out the enemy, which means their threshold for appearing is considerably lower. They don't need a fully fledged warp rift, they only need a weakness through which to pass. If this was the case, then we would expect to see an increase in Legion of the Damned activity if the veil between the worlds grew thinner. And as so happens, we recently had an example of just that, with the fall of Cadia and the full opening of the Eye of Terror and the splitting of the galaxy in two. Chaotic influence grew to a level never before seen, and just like chaos influence grew, so too did the appearances of the Legion of the Damned.
Nice.
Usually, the Legion appears very, very, very rarely, and yet after the fall of Cadia, hundreds, if not thousands, of sightings were reported, and bear in mind, anyone who's seen them will forget about the incident within hours and days at tops, which in all due likelihood means that there are thousands upon thousands of sightings that was simply never recorded.
I just couldn't remember.
As for why the lazy little buggers didn't appear on Cadia, well, mostly bad writing, honestly. No, that is the excuse I'm going to go with here. I am so fucking disappointed that the fall of Cadia, one of the most infamous and heavily defended fortress worlds in the Imperium, was described over the course of something like 20 pages. God damn it. that was worthy of an entire campaign book
Nice.
in and of itself. There should be volumes of lore based upon all of the heroic instances of resistance, the cataclysmic tank battles, the apocalyptic air duels above the planet, the countless fortress cities fighting street by street. It should have been so much, and it was so little, sadly enough. But to return to the point, this event also further solidifies the theory that they are in fact demons rather than actual fallen or corrupted space marines of some sort, because they are everywhere at once. Now, even if we assume that they were a fallen chapter, and the Firehawks in particular, we would also have to assume that they have to use the good old-fashioned spacecraft of the time and usual void travel, considering they apparently still possess spaceships. However, they seem to be traveling way too goddamn quickly. The Legion of the Damned has been recorded to be on quite exactly the opposite sides of the galaxy within hours, which is just not possible. Even the Eldar, with their webway network, can't travel anywhere near that quickly. Not to mention, of course, the fact that they appear on planet, not in orbit, and then drop down via drop pods. They literally appear planet-side.
Nice.
And since there's no teleportation signature accompanying their sudden appearance, there is once again no suggestion that they actually appear through any normal means, like teleportation, or drop pods, or transportation, or really anything else. So no, they are in all due likelihood good old-fashioned demons, which also explains a couple other things, like for example that they can take a goddamn super heavy tank round to the face and simply just shrug it off. That's not normal, even for Space Marines. Or the fact that when they apparently, quote-unquote, die, they do so in a burst of flames. When one is finally wounded or destabilized, he bursts into flames and fights on with increased vigor for a short period of time before disappearing in a pillar of fire, which again suggests that they're not exactly normal. Though all the way at the end here, I will be pointing out one little thing as well. Games Workshop has been going back and forth on the quote-unquote true identity of the Legion of the Damned for absolute ages. When they were originally introduced, they were kind of a mysterious force, then they were more or less confirmed to be Firehawks, and then in recent writing, they have been casting a lot of doubt on the idea that they are the Firehawks. At the end of the day, nobody really knows, because Games Workshop keeps changing their goddamn writing. Currently, at least in my opinion, it makes more sense for them to be demons, because they're doing shit that the Firehawks, even if they were corrupted, simply should not be able to do, like traversing the galaxy at the snap of a finger, for example. Even Chaos Forces, who are in direct cooperation with some form of chaotic deity, cannot control the tides of the warp to anywhere near that degree. And that, along with another whole ton of discrepancies, like, for example, the fact that the Legion of the Damned appear to be literally invulnerable, the fact that they die in a pile of fiery nonsense, which would mean that the Firehawks would long since have been extinct, since at last counting there were some 200 of them left, etc. Not to mention the fact that their doctrines wildly vary from that of the Firehawks. Now, the Firehawks were, as the Legion of the Damned are, quite fond of flamers and melter guns, but they preferred to deliver their fiery ordnance from orbit in mass-scale assaults, and they most certainly were not as quote-unquote gentle as the Legion of the Damned is. The Legion has been known to go to fairly extreme lengths to guarantee victory in the past, but the Firehawks were infamous for their firebombing of entire civilian populations just to make sure. Of course, there's always the possibility that the Legion of the Damned have been cleaning out some population centers every now and then and simply nobody's noticed, but, well, let's hope not. Because let's be frank here, the average Imperial citizen has enough shit to worry about already, without some brimstone ghost kicking down his door and murdering him and his entire family for wrongthink. But of course, at the end of the day, they are but peasants, and nobody really cares about the peasants.
Pretty much.
So, even if they did, it's probably fine. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you, Arch.
Have a good day.
Okay, so that was the Legion of the Damned the last of the Cursed Founding series by Arch Warhammer. If you're not checking out his stuff, there's a link in the description to help you find it. Same thing as usual, you know, go check him out if you're not watching him already. And this was requested by CJ Falcon. Quite informational, quite good stuff. Wow, where do I begin? I guess they're like when you turn on God mode on a video game. You turn them on, they can't really be hurt. When they die, they burst into flames and disappear off of the screen. They don't have to load their weapons. They probably don't even have to cock their weapons. Or go through the cycles. On top of many other things that are just crazy, which lets the possibility of them being many things affected directly by the warp, possibly lost, Firehawks, corrupted by the warp, all sorts of different things, possibly the spirits of the Astartes, but he ended up going where I thought he was going to go, coming up with this concept of, well, if it's a possibility with these gods that there is a god emperor that exists in the warp that fulfills the basic beliefs of the system of people who worship the god emperor, and he would be, until he becomes all powerful, he'd be tied to certain things. Well, what if he had a defense team that would come in? But like I said, beyond just, oh, well, these are his defending angels, this entity's angels that mimic the Astartes. I'd also go as far as, like I said before, so here's the fear of the enemy. Looking at these Astartes do not look friendly. They would be terrifying as all get out. These are monsters of men right here. And so, you know, maybe it's all the fear of all the collective enemies of mankind. Oh crud. Here's this Astartes. This is what they're like. You know? And oh, well, here's this, and then all the friendlies are like, well, here's this invincible angel coming out of nowhere to defend us with all of the Emperor's glory. And so you have a practically indestructible Astarte. Yeah, that's super terrifying. But that's kind of my spin on it, or at least what I would believe. It's probably a combination of a million different things. And also, this is a game. And so it's a good possibility that Game Workshop just makes it vague enough, giving you enough details to create amazing stories in your heads. Come up with this lore. Well, who is the damned? Well, they're this, because this is what I believe, and this is what my little character in the game is going to do about it. Just saying. It's a good possibility. It can happen. But anyways, so this is the end of that series. As far as I know, anyways. Yeah. So, time to keep moving. Until next time, Willie, out.
If you like the video, stay tuned for more content. And as always, feel free to comment. Have a good one.